just strip out all the noise of the economy and you just focus on Bitcoin, I think that Bitcoin is going to have a very big year. I think that, it could easily double from here this year with all the tailwinds that I've been talking about. I've been saying $180,000 in the fall of 2025 for a while now, and I think that that's still very much in play. Bitcoin is explosive. The one thing that you have to understand is if you're trading around this, please have your core position. Don't play with the core position because you could easily miss out. This could easily just outrun everything very quickly. Most people don't even talk about it. We have unpaid liabilities that reach into the hundreds of trillions. So you got $36.5 trillion of public debt, but then on top of it, you've got all these unpaid liabilities of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Now, let's take a step back. You've got the Doge Commission that's out there that's cutting expenses, and people say, some of the listeners might be saying, but what if we get into we get out of deficit and we actually are making money at the sovereign level, at the U.S. government is actually making money, and so the issue is that our deficit is so big, right, that it's over $2 trillion. If you look at the first quarter of 2025, remember the U.S. fiscal starts in October 1, so our first quarter just ended. We ran a $711 billion deficit. Well, do the math on that, right? That's a $2.8 trillion annual deficit. It was 39% higher than the first quarter deficit of 2024. So anybody wants to say like, well, yeah, but you've got your tax payments that come in April, so it's not really but if you look apples to apples for the prior year, which we ran a $2.1 trillion deficit, we're up over 35%, near 40% higher. Then you've got the Doge Commission that comes in, and they've saved, if you look at the debt clock, I guess it's saying that we've saved somewhere about $100 billion so far. And so, okay, that's great. How much can we really save? Number one. And then number two, how much fraud is there on this unpaid liability side that we're starting to see that we're paying Social Security to people who are 200 years old or something insane. I don't know if that's just clerical error or what's going on there. Where are those payments going? Well, we got to figure that out. Obviously, that is an issue. So maybe that $200 trillion number is $215 trillion number is lower, but it's still, they're not going to get it down to zero. So structurally, we have a problem, and that problem is that if you look at the debt, just really quickly, just big round numbers, we have mandatory expenses that are over $4 trillion. You've got defense that's $900 billion, almost a trillion dollars. You get net interest, the interest on our debt, which is $1 trillion, and which brings our total mandatory spending. This is stuff that's either in legislation or, you're not going to not pay, which is defense and interest on your own debt. You're not going to default on your debt. And then you've got discretionary spending of over $1 trillion. So even if Doge cut all that discretionary spending down to zero, they somehow got Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid down because of, massive, just leakage there and irresponsibility on the way they spend the money. And it's not specifically the dollars that are going to the recipients, but it's the administration. Even if they got that down, you'd have to get $1 trillion out of that, because you can't pull down an interest expense. It's highly unlikely that we're gonna cut our defense down in half. But even if you did that, you still have to get $500 billion out of your mandatory expenses. So where is it really going to come from? That's the question. So for us to get into surplus, that's super unlikely. I mean, I'd love it. I'd love to see it, but I don't think it's going to happen. So that's just the setup, right? So we're likely not getting into surplus. So we still have this $36.5 trillion of debt we've got to deal with. And how are you going to deal with that? Well, this is where the Bitcoin Reserve Act comes in. So Senator Lummis from Wyoming, her idea is, look, why don't we buy a million Bitcoin over 5 years. And over time, if you look at the performance of Bitcoin and how it is retaining its value against the debasement of all other currencies, then that reserve will enable us to pay down a very large portion of the debt in the future, or back treasuries with it, which will stabilize the treasury, and that ends up stabilizing the U.S. dollar, right? Because the biggest issue that we have right now, which has been growing over the last number of years, is that we're seeing sovereigns reluctant to own treasuries, to hold treasuries. Now, everybody around the world needs dollars, right? We're on the U.S. dollar is it's the reserve currency of the world. The U.S. Treasury is the reserve asset of the world. But we made some, key mistakes in this last administration, like cutting off Russia from SWIFT and seizing their assets, including treasuries. This just signaled the world that, well, you don't want to be holding treasuries unless you're a very, very good ally of the U.S., because they could just seize them from you. So we got to find something else to buy. So they've been buying gold. That you've seen that. A lot of them have been buying gold, and they've been buying Bitcoin. And so they know that it will hold its value over a long period of time against the dollar. So the previous thinking was, if you hold treasuries, you'll make an interest rate that'll give you at least a neutral return, if not a positive real return on that debasement, meaning the inflation is going up. You need to make more interest on your bonds to keep up with that inflation. But do we want to hold those now if they can be seized from us? That's an issue for all the BRICS countries. And so that's why you're hearing them talk about, they're not trying to, create a new currency for them. They just want to be able to get away from the treasury. That's the issue. They know that they're still going to need dollars. So that's the whole point. The Bitcoin and the strategic reserve then starts this game theory where all of these sovereigns have to, consider, what if the U.S. owns 5% of the Bitcoin, total Bitcoin float, and we own none? That's a problem. So now you're seeing countries step in and start putting Bitcoin on their balance sheets because of this, because they know that this could be a big problem if we don't own Bitcoin ourselves.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to echo one of the points you brought up, it's been a lot of undue pressure on Congress and just the U.S. government as a whole, seeing BRICS try to get away from the U.S. dollar system as a whole. I think a really important note that you brought up there is not that they're trying to create their own currency, but that, the sanctions that we've recently imposed on Russia because of the war in Ukraine and seizing their treasury bills has showed the downsides of a trust-based system, whereas, Bitcoin offers that trustless based system. And so I know, while some of these bigger countries that are part of the BRICS Pact, right, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, China, right, haven't outright said that they're holding Bitcoin. We know that like Russia has mentioned that they're mining it. We know China has reversed the mining ban stance and have actually started to introduce some of their own versions of strategy over there as well. I think very recently there is a company in Hong Kong that said that they're going to start adopting the strategy. I'm very tempted to always say MicroStrategy. hasn't fully clicked yet. But like we're seeing this play out in action, from the government level to institutions. Like people are very open and receptive to this. And so the U.S. is definitely in a precarious situation where, we live in a democracy, we live in a republic where everything has to be voted on and talked about publicly. And so we're talking about the strategic reserve. And I don't necessarily know what mechanisms are in place for us to quietly accumulate in the back, because the game theory would suggest that we need to do that.
Exactly.
Or
so we're running not sell what we already have, right?
Exactly. And, that places us in a kind of the situation where, Russia India, China could front run us. We're certainly seeing countries, obviously, like El Salvador is, the golden child in the Bitcoin community that first adopted, not only a Bitcoin standard, but nationalized Bitcoin as, one of the reserve currencies. And then in addition to that, more recently, right, we've seen Abu Dhabi start integrating the BlackRock ETFs into their sovereign wealth fund, right? So there's certainly a lot of positive momentum for integrating Bitcoin at the national and sovereign level. I guess the question really does remain, right? Like, if we do get a larger sovereign stacking Bitcoin, does that force the US to act faster? And what mechanisms are in place to allow that to happen, right? There's obviously congressional approval that could happen, but maybe perhaps there's some executive order. And if we go the executive order route, does that legislation stick?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. And, there are two paths, like you just said. Cynthia Lummis, she has the Bitcoin Act, and that would be the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve that we talked about, the million Bitcoin over 5 years, 200,000 Bitcoin a year. That would be the first. That's one that we've heard of. Also, we've heard since Trump was elected, people rumbling or talking about possibly an executive order. So what would that look like? Well, through the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, it's possible that he could use the Exchange Stabilization Fund in order to buy Bitcoin. Now, there's some differences here, though. So if he did it through executive order, that executive order could be overturned by the next administration pretty quickly, I would think. So that's one thing. So it's not really as powerful, but it's quicker. You could do it overnight and start accumulating Bitcoin immediately, And so what does that look like? Well, there's $200 billion in that fund. But that's not all available for Bitcoin. There might be 40, 50 or 60 billion available, maybe as much as half of it. But you're talking about, it's still a lot of Bitcoin, $40 billion. And let's say that they pass it and Bitcoin runs. I mean, it's not going to be at 120,000, That would mean that we're probably only buying 250,000 Bitcoin instead of 1 million. But we would be buying it quickly. Maybe half a million Bitcoin, but likely not. If he announced that order, that Bitcoin's going to, it's going to run pretty quickly because of what you just said. Everybody and their, sister and brother are going to be out there buying it, not just other nations. And so, you'll see a supply shock. The big thing is not so many people out there buying. It would be a lot. It would be the other half of it is people be reluctant to sell. Like, I'm not, if the government's gonna be out there buying, I'm not going to sell mine. So there would just be this liquidity issue. It would be a squeeze. And so that's one path. I think it's pretty low likelihood because you'd have to. There's some reasons for that. If he did that, he would be signaling to the world that he's worried about the U.S. dollar, exchange stabilization. Like, we have to stabilize our currency, that's a bad signal to the world. And that might send the wrong signal on the US dollar. So that would be worrisome. And I think he's probably reluctant to do that, even if it is something he could do. Because, he doesn't want to Trump really cares about his legacy, about how he's seen. He wants the market to be at all-time highs. I know his family owns some Bitcoin. He wouldn't mind that. I'm sure he wants his Trump coin to be at all-time highs. He's got a huge ego, and he wants his, like, he talks about the market all the time. If he initiated the Exchange Stabilization Fund to buy Bitcoin through an executive order, I mean, that might tip off a sell-off in the markets, in the general markets, because, oh my God, I don't want to own U.S. dollars. Even the government knows there's a problem because of all this debt. Because all these years we've been talking about debt. We've been talking about debt for decades and how it's a problem. It's never been a problem. So when you hear traditional market analysts talk about it, they're like, we'll deal with it like we always have. No big problem. It's just debt. It creates productivity and